everyone, welcome back to the Art of Business English. It's Andrew Ambrosius here again, and today I've got another interesting episode on direct versus diplomatic language. All right, so what do I mean by that? Well, in some cultures, with some languages, particularly Spanish, people speak in a very direct way, and when you're speaking in Spanish, for example, it sounds fine. Okay, it sounds okay to speak this way because that's how it is in Spanish. However, if you translate this into English, it can sound quite direct and even rude. Okay, so let's begin with today's episode: how to sound less direct and more diplomatic. Okay, so one of the biggest problems we face when we're using our business English is sounding too direct. Okay, you can be maybe a bit rude, in fact, and people get a bit stressed when they're in situations where they're negotiating, especially when you are not negotiating in your native language. So we need to be very careful and not sound rude, and we need to be diplomatic. Okay, so it's true that sometimes we say things and we even think that they sound okay, but to a native speaker of English, they will sound wrong, okay? So we need to be careful of that. And as long as you're aware of these things, you will start to understand what I mean. So in today's lesson, I'm going to make you aware of direct versus diplomatic language. All right, so we don't want to offend anyone, especially by accident, okay? By accident is sin querer. And the second problem is language and cultural differences, okay? As I mentioned in the beginning, Spanish is quite a direct language. And even though it sounds okay in Spanish, the problem arises when you translate this into English, okay? So let me give you an example of what I mean by that, all right? In Spanish, we can walk into a bar, all right? And we can say, hola, quiero un café, por favor. Okay, so you're going straight. Quiero un café, por favor. It's okay. That sounds fine in Spanish. However, if we say in English, hello, I want a coffee, please, it sounds too direct and a bit rude, because even though we're saying please, we don't use the verb want when we're requesting something from someone, okay? So we would in fact say something like, could I have a coffee, please? So we're using the conditional could and the verb have instead of I want. Okay, so that's the difference. Using the conditional softens the message, and changing the verb to have as opposed to want. Okay, so we need to be careful about the verbs and what type of tenses we use. Okay, so why is it important for my business English? Well, if you're negotiating or working with native English speakers, you don't want to sound rude. Okay, especially if you're dealing with clients. Okay, and some colleagues. It could result in you losing a sale. So what we need to do is learn some basic skills on how to sound less direct and more diplomatic, okay? So by the end of this episode today, you will be able to understand the following: the difference between direct and diplomatic language. I'll give you some tips for sounding more diplomatic. And then I'll be looking finally at the role that conditionals play in sounding more polite. Okay, so let's get started. Let's look then at the difference between direct and diplomatic language. In direct language, it's very simple and it's straight to the point. Okay, straight to the point is ir al grano. There are usually no problems with the understanding of the message. Okay, so the person understands very clearly what you mean. Okay, so sometimes speaking directly can be very useful and important. However, it can also sound rude or even aggressive. Okay, so some cultures do appreciate direct language. Okay, some cultures really prefer people to speak directly, say exactly what they mean or what they feel, and get straight to the point. Okay, this clarity is often appreciated. However, there are other cultures where being too direct is quite shocking. Okay, and people feel uncomfortable. So you need to be aware of the cultural differences, and also you need to be aware that when you speak using diplomatic language, you will be maybe less direct. So maybe people will have to interpret what you mean because you're not telling them exactly what you mean. In some cultures, when you say something, people will understand. They will interpret what you mean, okay? So diplomatic language is less direct and maybe not as clear as direct language. Direct language is very clear, okay? So let's look at some examples of the difference between direct and indirect, okay? So for example, very direct, I disagree. The diplomatic one would be, I'm not sure I agree, okay? Secondly, you're wrong. So very direct, you're wrong. I see what you mean, but, okay? So we're completely changing. You're wrong is very direct and maybe quite rude, whereas I see what you mean followed by but, okay? But is a great word for changing to your opinion. And the next one, I want you to do this. Okay, so I want is very direct, and then you, it's very personal. I want you to do this. All right, and then if we use the diplomatic version, would be I was wondering if you could do this. Okay, I was wondering. So we're using the past continuous, and we're using the if conditional. If you could. All right, so conditionals play a role in sounding more diplomatic. So does the past continuous. Okay, so let's look now at some tips for sounding more diplomatic, all right? So there are several things that we can do to sound more diplomatic and less direct. The first one, and probably the most important thing, I tell this to my students all the time, is that you need to show that you are listening, okay? One of the keys of life is to listen and then understand the other person's point of view, okay? It's okay to listen, but you also need to show them that you do understand their point of view, okay? And some expressions that we can use to show this are the following, okay? I see what you mean, but, all right? I see what you mean, but. You've raised a good point, but. Again, you can see I'm following it with but. I can see where you're coming from. All right, I can see where you're coming from. So all of these expressions show that you understand what the person's opinion is, okay, and their perspective. So let's look at some examples. I think we should cancel the contract. This is direct. I see what you mean, but don't you think that is a bit drastic? Okay, so the person's saying, I think we should cancel the contract. You're saying, I see what you mean, but don't you think that is a bit drastic? All right, another one. I'm in favor of aggressively reducing our prices to compete. All right, so that's direct. I'm in favor of aggressively reducing our prices to compete. As a response, you could say, you have raised a good point, but this may lead to a price war. You are not rejecting the person's idea completely. You're acknowledging that they have raised a good point, but you're countering with your idea. I want to fire him. Okay, it's very direct. I want to fire him. Le quiero despedir. So it's very direct. I can see where you're coming from, but shouldn't we try and train him first? Again, so you're acknowledging that you understand the person's point of view, but you're following it with your perspective and your opinion, okay? So what's the next thing we can do? Another tip. We can use positive words, all right? Instead of using negative words like terrible, bad, wrong, we can use positive words, all right? So let's have a look at some positive words. A negative version would be, I think that is a terrible idea. Okay, so terrible is a negative word. But the positive form would be, I think that is not the best idea. Okay, so what you can see I'm doing here is I'm negating the positive word. Okay, so instead of saying terrible, I'm negating not the best. Okay, best is a positive word and I'm using it in a negative form. Okay, so there are many other ways that we can do that. For example, you could say, I think that's not the most amazing thing I've heard, but it is interesting. Okay, so amazing is a positive word. I don't think the boss would be very happy with that. Okay, so happy is positive, but we're negating it, not very happy. That's a technique you can use. Okay, those are positive words, but we're negating them. All right, and what's another tip? Well, looking now at softners, all right? What do I mean by softners? not something related to washing your clothes, but we can use words that soften the message as well, okay? And they are called qualifiers. What are qualifiers? Well, qualifiers are words that are used to modify other words, okay? And with a qualifier, we can increase or decrease the quality of that word, okay? So very is a qualifier, all right? Very big, okay? So we're increasing the word big by using very to qualify it. Some other examples of qualifiers that are very commonly used in business English are a little, okay, and a bit. A little and a bit. All right. If we want to sound more diplomatic, we can use a little and a bit. And some other words which are quite often used and they can soften the message are just and quite. Okay. So let's take a look at just, quite, a little, and a bit in practice or in use. All right. So I'm sorry, but that is a little problem for us. Okay. So instead of saying it's a problem, we can say it's a little problem, okay? So we have made a negative sentence less negative by applying the qualifier a little. That is a bit confusing, okay? So instead of saying that is confusing, which is a negative sentence, you can say that is a bit confusing, which means you've decreased the quality of confusing, all right? So that makes it sound more diplomatic. Another one with just is, can I just interrupt you for a second? So you're asking a question. Just is making the question softer. Can I just interrupt you for a second? Instead of the direct form, which is, can I interrupt you for a second? All right. And another one, I'm afraid I didn't quite catch that. I'm afraid in this context is me temo, okay? It's like the same as saying I'm sorry. So I'm afraid I didn't quite catch that. This basically means you understood a little bit or nothing, but instead of saying I didn't understand you, you say I'm afraid I didn't quite catch that, meaning you understood a little bit or nothing, but you're saying it in a less direct and more polite way, okay? We can also use negative question forms. All right, so let's look at negative question forms. When we ask questions in the negative form, it does sound more polite. If we do this instead of using direct statements in the affirmative, we are then in fact making our statements more suggestive and less direct, okay? So we're sounding more suggestive and less direct, all right? So that is very simple. We're going to use the negative form. So the negative form of a question, don't you, didn't you, okay, things like that, all right? So some examples, maybe it's easier with some examples. We need to make some changes to your marketing plan. That is very direct, no? We need to make some changes to your marketing plan. If we say this, it sounds super direct and the other person will probably feel bad or get offended. It's also quite imperative, all right? You're forcing an obligation on them. To make this softer and more polite, we could say, don't you think we should make some changes to this marketing plan? So I'll repeat that. Don't you think we should make some changes to this marketing plan? So that's a question. Don't is negative, okay? So I'm using the negative question form. Should is a conditional, so that's softer as well. And I'm also using another technique, okay? What you'll notice here is that I've avoided using your. I've avoided using your marketing plan, and instead I've said this marketing plan. If you say this marketing plan, it sounds less personal, okay? Instead of your. Your is possession, ownership, okay? So if we avoid words like you and your, then it sounds less direct, less personal, and it sounds like you are not attacking the person. If you say you or your, it's quite aggressive and it's you're attacking that person and it's quite personal. So we do need to be careful with the subject you, okay, and the possessive pronoun your. All right. So Let's now move on to the next part, which is the role of conditionals. All right. So finally, we need to consider what role conditionals play in sounding more diplomatic. Okay. So conditionals always sound less direct. Can you help me is quite direct. Could you help me is less direct. We should also avoid using the imperative. Okay. Often, especially when you're stressed or busy, you can use the imperative like help me, do this, do that. Okay, this imperative is direct and it can be quite rude. Okay, so we need to try and avoid sounding too direct, and to do this we can use conditionals. All right, if we want to sound more diplomatic. Okay, so just to refresh, the conditionals I'm going to focus on today are could, would, should, and ought to. I'm not really going to look at the if conditionals, okay? But I just want to look at the sentences with could, would, should, and ought to. Remember, ought to is a synonym of should. So let's look at the direct form versus the conditional form. Let's invest all our money in Bitcoins, okay? So let's is imperative. The conditional form would be we could invest some of our money in Bitcoins. Again, some of our money is better than all of our money, okay? So you're being more diplomatic and more suggestive. The next example, direct form. Tell John I don't like his proposal. So tell is imperative. And again, his proposal, so that's the possessive pronoun. So you're making it personal by saying his. If we wanted to sound more conditional, more diplomatic, we could use the conditional form. Would you mind telling John I have some questions regarding the proposal? Okay, so would you mind, te importaría? This is much more polite than saying tell, which is imperative. Right, so the next one. We need to increase spending on R&D. Remember, R&D is M+D, it's research and development. Okay, so we need to is quite imperative, we need to. To sound more diplomatic, you could say, I think we should increase spending on R&D. Okay, so you're giving your opinion and you're using should as a suggestion as opposed to an imperative order. Finally, the next one is we have to cut costs. Have to, all right? So have to is also quite imperative. We have to cut costs. Whereas if we use the conditional, we could say, I think we ought to cut costs. Again, you're giving your opinion and it is less direct and more diplomatic, all right? Now, to take this one step further, what we can do is we can use the past continuous form, okay, or the past progressive form in English to form sentences that will sound more polite, okay? And if we combine the past continuous or past progressive form with conditionals, it will sound even better, all right? So, for example, instead of saying, I hope you will help me with this project, I hope, espero que me ayudarás con ese proyecto, I hope you will help me with this project, you could say, I was hoping you could help me with this project, okay? I was hoping sounds much more suggestive and less direct and more polite, okay? And as you're asking for help, we've used could instead of can, okay? Or could instead of will. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of this little episode on direct versus diplomatic language. Just some final thoughts now. Remember that in some languages, such as Spanish, you can speak quite directly and it's fine, okay? It sounds fine in Spanish. But when you do translate this into English, or if you use the same style in English, it can sound very direct, quite rude or aggressive, okay? And if we want to be good negotiators or a good host when we have international guests coming to our company, then we need to understand how to sound polite and diplomatic, okay? And if you say something that sounds too direct, remember, don't be afraid to say sorry, okay? And correct yourself. Maybe you notice that the person reacts in a strange way to your comments. Don't be afraid of saying sorry, okay? Many people will understand, okay? And they will have no problem with you saying sorry and correcting yourself. And as always, we'd like to thank you for joining us. It's great to have you here. If you do have any questions, then please don't hesitate to put some comments in this post or on the post accompanying this podcast. You can also link to our Facebook group and put some comments there. And if you do like this episode or this post, then please share it with your friends, and you can also subscribe to us on our podcast channel on iTunes. And of course, until next time, take care and keep having fun putting your business English into practice. Bye for now.